The following content is provided strictly for educational and entertainment purposes only and does not constitute professional career, financial, legal, tax, or medical advice. The discussions regarding travel nursing compensation, contract terms, housing stipends, and working conditions are based on historical trends, publicly available data, and individual case studies. The healthcare industry is highly dynamic, and individual results or potential outcomes will vary significantly based on geographic location, clinical specialty, agency negotiation, and market demand. Viewers must conduct their own comprehensive due diligence, consult with certified public accountants regarding tax-free stipend eligibility, and review all contracts with legal professionals before making any career transitions or financial decisions. We do not promise any specific financial results or lifestyle improvements. The experiences detailed in this masterclass reflect potential outcomes based on historical trends and should not be taken as a definitive guide to guaranteed success in the healthcare field. Imagine stepping through the sliding glass doors of a Level 1 trauma center in a major metropolitan city. You arrived in exactly 48 hours ago. You do not know the layout of the critical care supply room. You do not know the attending physicians by name or temperament. You do not even know the access code to the staff locker room. Yet, within 10 minutes of clocking in for a 12-hour shift, you are handed the complex medical charts for 3 critically ill patients whose lives literally depend on your immediate clinical judgment. The charge nurse hands you a generic security badge, points down a chaotic, brightly lit hallway echoing with the relentless, rhythmic alarms of cardiac monitors and ventilators, and simply says, "Good luck." This is not a hypothetical scenario designed for a dramatic television show. This is the stark, unvarnished, everyday reality for tens of thousands of travel nurses currently operating within the United States healthcare infrastructure. Over the past several years, the American medical system has experienced a fundamental tectonic shift in how it staffs its most critical departments. We have witnessed a massive, unprecedented exodus of permanent staff nurses, driven away from the bedside by severe burnout, perpetually stagnant wages, and rapidly deteriorating working conditions. In their wake, a multi-billion-dollar shadow industry of third-party medical staffing has exploded into the mainstream. You have almost certainly seen the viral videos or read the sensationalized financial headlines detailing historical trends where travel nurses were grossing $5,000, $8,000, or even $10,000 a single week during the peak of severe national health crises. You have heard the captivating stories of young professionals paying off massive, crippling student loan debts in a matter of 6 months, buying investment properties in cash, and taking extended luxurious vacations in tropical destinations between their contracts. But those flashy headlines only tell a very small fraction of the complete story. They deliberately omit the hidden financial costs, the severe psychological toll of constant relocation, and the ruthless corporate machinery that orchestrates this entire temporary staffing system. The controversy surrounding this profession runs incredibly deep. Right now, across the country, powerful hospital systems are paying third-party staffing agencies exorbitant hourly bill rates, often triple or quadruple the amount they pay their own loyal, permanent staff nurses who are working the exact same shift, on the exact same floor, handling the exact same patient acuity. This stark financial disparity creates a profound and highly toxic rift in the hospital environment. Imagine being a dedicated staff nurse who has committed a decade of your career to a specific intensive care unit, only to be assigned the frustrating task of training a brand new travel nurse who is earning 3 times your annual salary, while making entirely different clinical decisions and leaving after 13 weeks. The animosity on the floor can be palpable, and the patient care dynamics become incredibly complex to navigate. We are going to thoroughly examine real-world case studies of experienced nurses who left the comfort of their secure, unionized staff positions to chase the lucrative financial allure of travel contracts, only to find themselves isolated in hostile, unwelcoming work environments, abruptly canceled by their agencies without pay, or severely audited by the Internal Revenue Service because they fundamentally misunderstood the highly complex tax laws governing duplicated living expenses and tax-free housing stipends. This creates a massive open loop that we must close today. Why are intelligent, highly trained medical professionals throwing themselves into the chaotic, profoundly uncertain world of travel nursing, and more importantly, is the financial compensation actually worth the potential destruction of their mental health and long-term career stability? What truly happens behind closed doors when a hospital administration decides overnight that they no longer have the budget for the travelers they legally signed 13-week contracts with? And what is the single catastrophic administrative mistake that forces over half of all first-time travel nurses to permanently abandon the entire industry after completing their very first assignment. In this comprehensive deep dive masterclass, we are going to entirely tear down the facade of the travel nursing industry and show you exactly what a day in the life truly looks like. From the exact moment the alarm clock rings in an overpriced, short-term rental apartment to the moment the exhaustive 12-hour shift finally ends. For our American audience currently navigating the extreme complexities of modern career choices, this video solves the critical problem of information asymmetry. The massive travel nursing agencies have entire floors of corporate recruiters highly trained in aggressive, high-pressure sales tactics, specifically designed to maximize their corporate commission margins at the direct expense of your weekly paycheck. Today we level that playing field entirely. We are going to meticulously break down the anatomy of a travel nurse pay package with absolute mathematical precision. You will learn the historical trends behind blended rates, the critical legal difference between fully taxable hourly base wages and non-taxable federal per diems, and how the United States General Services Administration dictates the maximum allowable stipends for every single county in the country. We will explore the rigorous, often overwhelming credentialing and compliance process, dissecting the exact medical records, federal background checks, and complex state licensure requirements you must successfully navigate just to submit your professional profile for consideration. We will not offer you superficial, high-level advice. Instead, we will walk step by step through the harsh reality of hospital orientation, or rather the severe and dangerous lack thereof. We will explore the intense psychological resilience required to float between vastly different specialized hospital units, adapting to entirely different electronic medical record systems on the fly, all while fiercely protecting your hard-earned nursing license from potential legal liabilities. Whether you are a nursing student contemplating your future career trajectory, a burned-out staff nurse desperately looking for a viable financial exit strategy, or simply an outside observer fascinated by the hidden economic engines currently driving the United States healthcare system, this masterclass is designed to provide you with the complete, unvarnished truth. We will analyze historical case studies of effective negotiation tactics, showing you exactly how experienced travelers leverage competing agency offers to heavily maximize their potential outcomes. We will discuss the severe realities of securing short-term, furnished housing in highly competitive, inflated real estate markets, and the immense financial risks of signing rental leases before a hospital contract is fully executed and guaranteed by the facility. By the end of this presentation, you will possess a profound, professional-grade understanding of the entire travel nursing ecosystem, equipping you with the precise knowledge to see past the viral internet hype and truly understand the exact mechanics, the profound risks, and the realistic potential of a day in the life of a travel nurse in America. Let us begin by examining the exact moment a highly skilled medical professional decides to sever ties with their permanent employer and step into the unpredictable void of temporary staffing. Imagine, if you will, Sarah, a critical care registered nurse with 4 years of dedicated experience at a mid-sized community hospital in Columbus, Ohio. The current year is 2026, and the American healthcare landscape is still aggressively recalibrating from the massive systemic disruptions of the early decade. Sarah is currently earning a base hourly wage of $36. After federal and state taxes, exorbitant health insurance premiums, union dues, and mandatory retirement contributions, her biweekly take-home pay barely covers her steadily rising rent, her mounting student loan payments, and basic daily living expenses. During a designated 30-minute lunch break, she logs onto a professional nursing forum and reads a detailed case study posted by a former colleague. That colleague is now working a 13-week travel contract in Phoenix, Arizona, taking home a weekly net pay of $2,800. For Sarah and thousands of professionals exactly like her, the stark mathematical disparity is no longer just a source of daily frustration. It becomes the ultimate, undeniable catalyst for a massive career transition. But executing this leap is rarely as simple as submitting a basic resume on a corporate website. The precise moment Sarah creates a digital profile on a major travel nursing job board, her phone begins to ring relentlessly. This introduces us to the first critical and often misunderstood component of the travel nursing ecosystem, the corporate healthcare recruiter. You must understand that third-party staffing agencies are essentially highly sophisticated logistics and brokerage firms. The recruiters on the other end of the phone are not your personal career counselors. They are highly incentivized sales professionals whose personal commission income is directly tied to the profit margin of your specific contract. When a major hospital system in Seattle desperately needs an emergency room nurse to cover a sudden staffing deficit, They might offer a master vendor agency a bill rate of $150 per hour. The agency then meticulously calculates their internal corporate overhead, their required profit margin, their liability insurance costs, and ultimately offers the travel nurse a fraction of that total amount. Historical trends within the industry show that uneducated first-time travelers frequently leave thousands of dollars in potential earnings on the table, simply because they do not understand the mechanics of this high-stakes negotiation. Experienced travel nurses mitigate this by utilizing a strategy known as agency pitting, where they actively maintain relationships with 3 or 4 different recruiters simultaneously, forcing them to compete against one another to secure the highest possible percentage of that master bill rate. To truly grasp the day-to-day reality of this profession, we must dissect the complex anatomy of a travel nurse pay package. Unlike a traditional permanent employee who simply receives a straightforward gross hourly wage, a travel nurse is compensated through a highly complex, bifurcated system known as a blended rate. This specific financial structure consists of 2 distinct parts: a fully taxable base hourly wage and a non-taxable stipend intended strictly for duplicated housing expenses and daily meals and incidentals. The federal government, specifically the United States General Services Administration, strictly dictates the maximum allowable non-taxable stipends for every single county in the country. For example, a 13-week contract located in the heart of San Francisco will legally allow for a drastically higher maximum housing stipend than a contract situated in rural Nebraska, reflecting the massive, localized disparity in the cost of living. However, staffing agencies will often manipulate these specific numbers to make a contract appear incredibly lucrative on a superficial level. They might artificially lower your fully taxable base wage to just $20 an hour, while completely maximizing the tax-free stipends. While this aggressive tactic drastically increases your weekly net take-home pay in the short term, it simultaneously creates massive, hidden long-term financial consequences. If Sarah accepts a severely suppressed hourly taxable rate, she is severely crippling her future ability to secure a conventional home mortgage or an auto loan, because financial lenders base their strict debt-to-income ratio calculations primarily on verifiable taxable income, entirely disregarding those massive tax-free stipends. Furthermore, if she ever suffers a severe, career-ending workplace injury while lifting a heavy patient, her long-term worker compensation benefits will be calculated using that artificially low $20 base rate, potentially leaving her in a state of sudden and catastrophic financial ruin. Once Sarah successfully negotiates a comprehensive pay package that responsibly balances her immediate cash flow needs with long-term financial safety, she enters the grueling clinical submission phase. This is not a standard corporate job interview process where you sit across a desk and discuss your greatest weaknesses. Travel nursing operates on a hyper-competitive, fiercely fast-paced, first-come, first-served basis. Sarah must immediately compile a massive digital dossier containing her active state nursing licenses, highly detailed skills checklist validating her exact competency with specific medical equipment like continuous renal replacement therapy machines, comprehensive federal background checks, rigorous 10-panel drug screens, and multiple glowing references from recent clinical charge nurses. This entire package is then fed into a hospital vendor management system. If her compliance profile is missing a single page of a basic life support certification or a recent tuberculosis test, her file will be instantly bypassed by the automated software before a human clinical manager ever sets eyes on her resume. Now, imagine the intense psychological tension when the formal offer finally arrives via email on a Tuesday afternoon. The intensive care unit in Phoenix wants Sarah to start orientation in exactly 14 days. She has exactly 24 hours to sign the legally binding contract. The initial euphoria of the massive pay increase is instantly eclipsed by a crushing wave of logistical panic. She must submit a formal resignation to her current unit manager, potentially burning a professional bridge she spent 4 entire years carefully building. She must figure out how to pack her entire existence into the trunk of her compact sedan. But most terrifyingly, she must secure safe, fully furnished, and affordable short-term housing in a major metropolitan city she has never even visited, entirely from 2,000 miles away. And this is precisely where the glamorous internet dream of travel nursing often transforms into a devastating logistical nightmare. Because what the glossy agency marketing brochures entirely fail to mention is the ruthless, predatory reality of the short-term housing market in the modern era. As Sarah desperately scours the internet for a 3-month lease that will not completely consume her entire tax-free stipend, she is about to walk directly into one of the most devastating financial traps in the entire temporary staffing industry: a trap that forces thousands of optimistic nurses into crippling debt before they even complete their very first clinical shift. How do sophisticated digital scammers specifically target vulnerable, out-of-state travel nurses? And what exactly happens to your bank account when you sign an ironclad rental lease, only to have the hospital administration abruptly cancel your lucrative contract 48 hours before you are scheduled to arrive? Let us explore the mechanics of this highly specific, highly lucrative digital fraud network that preys exclusively on transient healthcare workers. Historical trends over the past 5 years indicate an exponential rise in sophisticated housing scams targeting travel nurses. Imagine if you are Michael, an emergency room nurse with 6 years of trauma experience, securing a high-paying winter contract in Austin, Texas in 2026. Michael utilizes popular social media groups, explicitly dedicated to travel nurse housing to bypass the exorbitant corporate fees of traditional short-term rental platforms. He finds a pristine, fully furnished one-bedroom apartment, situated exactly 2 miles from his assigned hospital. The listed landlord, communicating via encrypted messaging applications, provides a seemingly legitimate lease agreement, a digitally altered copy of a state driver license, and perfectly staged photographs of the property. The catch is that the Austin housing market is fiercely competitive, and the landlord utilizes high-pressure tactics, requiring an immediate wire transfer or digital peer-to-peer payment for the first month of rent and a hefty security deposit just to hold the unit. Exhausted from back-to-back clinical shifts at his current job and desperate to secure shelter before his fast-approaching start date, Michael wires $3,500. When he finally drives across the country with his life packed in a sedan and arrives at the physical address, a permanent family answers the door. They have lived there for a decade and have absolutely no knowledge of the individual who took Michael's money. The digital footprint of the scammer vanishes instantly, the phone number is disconnected, and the local police department classifies it as a highly untraceable civil matter. Michael is now fundamentally stranded in a new city, completely drained of his liquid savings, and scheduled to work a 12-hour trauma shift in less than 24 hours. But even if a travel professional successfully navigates the perilous landscape of short-term rentals and secures entirely legitimate housing, they remain perpetually exposed to the single greatest financial vulnerability in the entire temporary staffing industry: the at-will contract cancellation. The term contract in travel nursing is dangerously misleading to those outside the profession. Unlike a binding corporate employment agreement that guarantees severance pay or a fixed term of continuous work, a travel nurse contract heavily favors the hospital facility and the staffing agency. Let us examine a documented case study of Jessica, a highly specialized pediatric intensive care nurse who accepted a lucrative 13-week assignment in Denver, Colorado. She responsibly secured a legitimate 3-month apartment lease, paid her non-refundable upfront costs, and drove 15 hours to her new destination. Exactly 48 hours before she was scheduled to attend the mandatory hospital orientation, her corporate recruiter called with devastating news. The hospital administration had experienced a sudden, unexpected drop in their pediatric patient census, or perhaps they managed to successfully hire a cohort of new graduate staff nurses at a fraction of the cost. Regardless of the internal administrative reasoning or the facility's budget constraints, Jessica's contract was abruptly canceled before she ever clocked in. In the unforgiving ecosystem of temporary healthcare staffing, the massive financial fallout of this cancellation falls entirely and exclusively on the shoulders of the nurse. The third-party staffing agency does not owe Jessica any compensation for her travel expenses or her time. The hospital system owes her absolutely nothing for the abrupt termination of the agreement. Yet, Jessica is now legally bound to a massive, ironclad rental lease in an incredibly expensive metropolitan real estate market with zero incoming revenue to support it. This is the stark, terrifying reality that the glossy recruitment advertisements and viral social media posts strategically omit. The extraordinarily high hourly bill rates and the maximized tax-free stipends are inherently designed by the free market to compensate for this exact lack of job security. However, when a cancellation actually occurs, the mathematical advantage of travel nursing evaporates instantly, often plunging the professional into severe, immediate debt. The nurse must then frantically contact their agency recruiter, begging for any available assignment within a 50-mile radius, often forced to accept significantly lower pay packages simply to survive the financial obligations they have already committed to in that specific geographic region. Now, let us pivot and assume the most favorable potential outcomes for our scenario. The housing is legitimate, the hospital census remains extremely high, the facility budget is secure, and the contract remains fully intact. The travel nurse finally arrives at the hospital campus for day one of their assignment. This brings us directly to the profound and highly dangerous myth of the travel nurse orientation. When a permanent staff nurse is hired into a critical care unit or an emergency department, they typically undergo a rigorous, multi-month onboarding process. They are paired with a dedicated, experienced clinical preceptor. They are slowly and methodically introduced to the specific electronic medical record system. They learn the exact physical locations of all emergency equipment, and they are gradually assigned higher acuity patients only as their clinical confidence and institutional knowledge grow. The hospital heavily invests time, money, and educational resources into ensuring this permanent employee is fully integrated into the culture and exact safety protocols of the specific facility. For a travel nurse operating in 2026, this vital orientation process is aggressively compressed into a dangerously brief and chaotic window. A standard travel assignment orientation often consists of nothing more than 4 to 8 hours in a generic, windowless hospital conference room. The nurse is subjected to a rapid-fire presentation on basic fire safety protocols, generic corporate compliance rules, and a brief, highly inadequate overview of the facility charting software. They are then handed a generic security badge, given a brief tour of the locker room, and sent directly to the clinical floor to take a full patient assignment. There is no dedicated preceptor watching over their shoulder. There is no grace period for acclimatization to the new environment. The hospital administration views the travel nurse as an extraordinarily expensive, fully functional, plug-and-play medical asset. Because the facility is paying the third-party agency a premium, inflated bill rate, the management expects immediate, flawless clinical execution from the exact moment the nurse clocks in for their very first shift. Imagine the intense cognitive overload and skyrocketing adrenaline of walking onto a highly specialized cardiovascular intensive care unit, where you do not know a single human being's name. You do not know where the life-saving crash cart is physically located in relation to your patient's room. You do not know the unwritten, highly specific operational preferences of the demanding attending surgeons. You do not even know the alphanumeric door code required to access the central medication dispensing machine. Yet, you are instantly expected to function at the exact same level of clinical proficiency as the veteran staff nurses who have worked on that specific unit for a decade. Every single hospital uses slightly different intravenous pumps, different continuous renal replacement therapy machines, and vastly different protocols for administering high-risk titratable cardiac medications. This profound lack of institutional knowledge fundamentally severely compromises patient safety and places the travel nurse's hard-earned professional license in constant, active jeopardy every single minute of the shift. Every single clinical decision is made under a microscope by the permanent staff, and any deviation from the facility-specific protocols, even if those protocols were never adequately explained during that brief morning orientation, can result in an immediate, detrimental termination of the contract. The psychological pressure of navigating this highly volatile environment is immense. The travel nurse must possess an extraordinary level of clinical adaptability, thick-skinned emotional resilience, and sheer professional audacity to survive the first week alone. They must aggressively advocate for themselves and their patients, constantly asking rapid-fire questions of potentially resentful permanent staff members who are chronically exhausted by the endless revolving door of temporary, highly paid workers. But the true ultimate test of a travel nurse's endurance does not occur during this chaotic orientation phase, or the initial introduction to the unit. The real unvarnished nightmare begins when the charge nurse sits down at the central desk to finalize the clinical shift assignments for the next 12 hours. What exactly happens when a temporary travel nurse, completely unfamiliar with the hospital's specific life support equipment and physician communication protocols, is deliberately handed the 3 most complex, unstable, and medically critical patients on the entire floor simply because the permanent staff actively and aggressively refuse to take them? And how does a travel nurse legally protect their individual license when they are abruptly mandated by administration to float to an entirely different medical specialty they have absolutely zero formal training in, facing a catastrophic patient emergency entirely alone? This terrifying scenario is known within the healthcare industry as floating, and it represents one of the most severe professional hazards a temporary medical worker will ever face. Floating is a standard operational procedure where hospital administration forcefully reassigns a nurse from their designated home unit to an entirely different clinical department, experiencing a sudden, unexpected staffing crisis. Historical trends across major national hospital networks dictate that travel nurses are universally the very first individuals selected to float, completely shielding the permanent core staff from the massive inconvenience and high stress of changing units. But the Board of Nursing in any given state does not grant professional leniency simply because a registered nurse is a temporary traveler. The absolute second you accept the patient handover report and assume care, you are legally held to the exact same rigorous standard of clinical practice as a board-certified specialist who has worked in that specific department for a decade. Let us carefully examine a realistic case study involving David, a highly proficient adult medical surgical nurse working a lucrative winter contract in Miami, Florida during the peak respiratory season of 2026. 2 hours into a relatively stable shift, the nursing supervisor approaches David with devastating news. The pediatric emergency overflow unit is critically understaffed due to a massive influx of influenza admissions, and David is being immediately redeployed to the basement. David has not formally assessed a pediatric patient since his collegiate nursing clinical rotations over a decade ago. He is suddenly responsible for accurately calculating and titrating highly sensitive, weight-based intravenous fluids for severely dehydrated infants. If David miscalculates a specialized pediatric medication dosage by even a fraction of a single milliliter, the clinical outcome could be instantly catastrophic. However, if he refuses the assignment outright, citing his profound lack of pediatric experience, the hospital administration can immediately terminate his 13-week contract for direct insubordination. Consequently, the third-party staffing agency will likely blacklist his professional profile from future employment opportunities, and the hospital could potentially report him to the State Board of Nursing for the severe offense of patient abandonment. To survive this impossible situation, David must utilize a highly specific, high-risk workplace negotiation tactic. He must formally declare to the hospital supervisor, in documented writing, that he is clinically incompetent to manage critical pediatric ventilator patients, but he must simultaneously offer to act as a task-oriented nurse. This means he agrees to administer basic oral medications, perform routine vital sign checks, and assist with physical mobility, while a specialized permanent staff nurse strictly oversees the complex critical thinking and high-level medical interventions. But securing this precarious, legally delicate compromise requires the willing, active cooperation of the permanent staff, which introduces us directly to the profound psychological isolation of the travel nursing experience. The permanent core staff on this receiving unit are acutely aware that David is earning a vastly superior hourly blended rate. This stark financial discrepancy frequently breeds a highly toxic, deeply resentful, and utterly unforgiving work environment. When David politely asks a veteran staff nurse to double verify a complex, high-alert medication dosage, he is frequently met with a cold, dismissive sigh, or he is outright ignored while the staff continues their casual personal conversations. He is effectively operating on an isolated clinical island. There is no cohesive teamwork, no friendly camaraderie, and absolutely no professional margin for human error. The tension is so thick that David spends his rare, legally mandated 30-minute meal break eating a cold protein bar in a secluded concrete emergency stairwell, just to escape the palpable heavy hostility radiating from the permanent staff break room. Furthermore, David is acutely aware that the corporate liability insurance provided by his travel agency is inherently designed to fiercely protect the agency's massive financial assets, not his individual professional nursing license. If a catastrophic medical error occurs, the hospital and the agency will immediately point the finger at the temporary contractor, leaving David to face potential civil lawsuits and severe board disciplinary actions entirely alone, unless he had the foresight to purchase a comprehensive, independent malpractice insurance policy out of his own pocket. Returning to the clinical floor after his brief respite, David faces the grueling technological nightmare of customized hospital charting software. While massive, centralized digital electronic medical record systems are utilized nationwide, every single individual hospital corporation heavily customizes the user interface to specifically fit their internal billing metrics and unique operational workflows. An experienced permanent staff nurse knows the exact, heavily memorized keyboard shortcuts to chart a comprehensive, head-to-toe physical patient assessment in exactly 4 minutes. David, however, spends an agonizing 45 minutes frantically clicking through endless, completely unfamiliar digital drop-down menus simply trying to document a basic neurological pupil check. This massive technological friction puts him dangerously behind his strict medication administration schedule. The automated medication dispensing cabinets, Complex machines that hold thousands of potent narcotics and critical care drugs often fail to seamlessly synchronize with these customized electronic medical records. David must meticulously cross-reference the digital physician orders with the physical medication drawer, knowing that a single incorrect button press could result in a devastating medication variance report that will permanently remain on his professional record. As the chaotic 12-hour shift violently bleeds into 13 hours, severe physical and cognitive degradation sets in. The phenomenon clinically known as alarm fatigue becomes a serious, life-threatening danger. The relentless echoing symphony of critical ventilator alarms, cardiac monitor warnings, and intravenous pump beeps blends into a deafening, normalized roar. David is operating on 3 hours of fractured, low-quality sleep, navigating a highly hostile medical unit, utilizing completely unfamiliar technology, and desperately trying to keep 4 critically ill strangers alive until the morning shift finally arrives to relieve him. When the clock finally strikes 7 in the morning, David drags his exhausted body to the staff locker room, his scrubs stained with iodine and sheer exhaustion radiating through every joint. He survived the trial by fire. He successfully protected his medical license for 1 more day. And when Friday morning finally arrives, he opens his secure mobile banking application to see a massive, direct deposit of $3,200 successfully clear into his checking account. For a brief, fleeting moment, the extreme psychological torture and the immense legal liability feel entirely justified. He is making incredible accelerated financial progress, rapidly paying down his accumulated collegiate debts, and securing his long-term economic future. But this massive weekly influx of cash completely masks a silent, catastrophic financial vulnerability that actively destroys the lives of countless unsuspecting travel nurses every single year. Because while David firmly believes that massive tax-free housing stipend is entirely his to keep, the United States Internal Revenue Service views that specific money through a very different, highly aggressive, and utterly unforgiving legal lens. What exactly is a duplicated tax home? And how does a single missing grocery receipt from 3 years ago trigger a devastating federal audit that forces a travel nurse to immediately repay tens of thousands of dollars in back taxes, alongside severe financial penalties, completely wiping out years of grueling, hard-earned clinical labor? To truly comprehend the catastrophic financial danger lurking beneath the surface of a travel nurse pay package, we must meticulously dissect the complex federal tax regulations governing temporary itinerant workers in the United States. It is imperative to state clearly that this discussion relies upon historical trends and publicly available tax court rulings, and serves strictly for educational purposes, not as formalized financial or tax advice. The entire economic advantage of the travel nursing industry hinges upon the legal utilization of tax-free stipends. These stipends, dictated by the General Services Administration, are not a performance bonus, nor are they a supplementary income stream. In the strict eyes of the Internal Revenue Service, these weekly payments are explicitly classified as a reimbursement for duplicated living expenses incurred while temporarily working away from your permanent residence. This introduces the single most misunderstood and highly penalized concept in the entire temporary staffing ecosystem, which is the legal establishment and maintenance of a primary tax home. Imagine a scenario involving Emily, a highly skilled telemetry nurse embarking on her travel career in the year 2026. Emily currently lives in an apartment in Charlotte, North Carolina. She accepts a highly lucrative 13-week contract in San Diego, California. Wanting to maximize her absolute financial profit and rapidly eliminate her student loan debt, Emily decides to officially terminate her apartment lease in Charlotte. She packs her belongings into a storage unit, drives across the country, and rents a small room in San Diego. For the next 13 weeks, she receives her fully taxable hourly base wage, plus a massive weekly non-taxable stipend of $1,500 intended for housing and meals. On paper, her bank account is growing at an unprecedented exponential rate. However, by legally terminating her lease in North Carolina, Emily fundamentally destroyed her primary tax home. Because she is no longer actively paying fair market value for a primary residence while simultaneously paying for a secondary short-term rental in California, she is no longer duplicating her living expenses. Under federal tax law, Emily has officially transitioned into what is classified as an itinerant worker. An itinerant worker, by strict legal definition, carries their tax home with them wherever they go, meaning they are absolutely disqualified from receiving any non-taxable stipends whatsoever. The immediate reality of this classification might not surface during the active contract. The third-party staffing agency will happily continue to deposit the tax-free money into Emily's account every single Friday. The staffing agency's legal liability is completely protected by a very specific, densely worded document called a tax home declaration form, which Emily hastily signed electronically during her initial credentialing process. By signing that specific digital document, Emily legally certified under penalty of perjury that she maintained a valid tax home, completely absolving the corporate agency of any future tax liabilities, and placing the federal crosshairs squarely and exclusively on her own shoulders. The true financial devastation typically occurs 2 to 3 years later. Historical case studies demonstrate a high frequency of targeted federal audits directed specifically at healthcare professionals who consistently report extraordinarily low taxable base incomes paired with massive, disproportionate non-taxable stipends. When the formal audit letter inevitably arrives in Emily's mailbox, the burden of absolute proof falls entirely upon her. The federal auditor will not accept a vague verbal explanation. They will demand a rigorous, exhaustive, and highly organized chronological archive of her financial life. They will legally mandate the production of a formal lease agreement or a recorded mortgage statement for a primary residence in North Carolina during the exact time frame she was working in California. They will demand comprehensive, unaltered bank statements proving that she was actively paying fair market value rent or mortgage payments for that primary home, alongside secondary bank statements proving she was simultaneously paying for the short-term rental in San Diego. Furthermore, the concept of fair market value becomes a brutal trap for young professionals trying to manipulate the system. Consider a separate case study involving Matthew, an operating room nurse in 2026, who attempts a common but highly dangerous workaround. Matthew uses his parents' house in suburban Chicago as his official permanent address. To simulate a tax home, he transfers exactly $100 a month to his mother and calls it rent, while he travels the country collecting massive stipends. When Matthew is inevitably audited, the federal investigator will completely invalidate this arrangement. Historical tax court precedents clearly dictate that paying a nominal, deeply discounted familial rate does not constitute the legitimate maintenance of a tax home. Matthew must prove he was paying the actual verifiable fair market value for a comparable room in that specific geographic zip code, actively sharing the proportional cost of residential utilities and structural maintenance. When the federal auditor officially determines that Emily or Matthew failed to legally maintain a tax home and duplicate their expenses, the resulting financial penalty is swift, merciless, and completely ruinous. Every single dollar of those massive, non-taxable housing and meal stipends they collected over the past 3 years is immediately reclassified as fully taxable standard income. They will instantly owe tens of thousands of dollars in back federal taxes. But the calculation does not stop there. The government will aggressively apply compound interest to that newly established debt, calculated retroactively from the exact date the original tax return was filed. They will then assess severe financial failure to pay penalties and potential substantial underpayment penalties. A travel nurse who thought they were aggressively building a lucrative financial future can wake up on a Tuesday morning facing a sudden, legally binding federal tax bill exceeding $50,000, completely wiping out years of grueling, hard-earned clinical labor in a matter of hours. This profound, underlying financial anxiety heavily compounds the extreme daily stress of the clinical environment we previously explored. The travel nurse is fundamentally trapped in a highly pressurized pressure cooker, simultaneously battling hostile hospital environments, protecting their delicate clinical license from immediate jeopardy, and meticulously maintaining an airtight forensic accounting of every single geographical movement and financial transaction they execute. But even if a professional flawlessly navigates the treacherous federal tax laws, maintains a perfect duplicate expense ledger, and survives the brutal clinical floating assignments without a single patient care error, they remain completely exposed to an entirely different, highly specialized form of professional destruction. The medical industry operates on a complex, highly punitive regulatory framework that varies wildly across different geographic jurisdictions. What exactly happens when a travel nurse, operating strictly within their established scope of practice, is maliciously reported to a state board of nursing located 2,000 miles away from their permanent home? And how does the highly controversial Nurse Licensure Compact weaponize a single, unproven administrative complaint into an automatic, nationwide suspension of their legal right to work? The Nurse Licensure Compact, frequently heavily marketed by corporate staffing agencies as the ultimate bureaucratic liberation for medical professionals, is a multi-state agreement that allows a registered nurse to hold one primary license in their home state, while legally practicing in over 40 participating states. On paper, this system appears to be a massive logistical advantage, completely eliminating the need to pay exorbitant fees and wait months for individual state boards to process complex licensure applications. However, within the highly volatile and inherently hostile environment of temporary staffing we have meticulously detailed, this exact compact transforms into a highly efficient, terrifying weapon of mass professional destruction. To understand this immense vulnerability, we must look at the specific, aggressive mechanisms of cross-state regulatory reporting based on historical trends within the healthcare legal system. Imagine a scenario involving Robert, an incredibly diligent and highly experienced trauma nurse whose primary, permanent tax home and legal residence is located in Austin, Texas. In the year 2026, Robert accepts a high-stress, critically understaffed assignment in a major metropolitan hospital in Atlanta, Georgia. Both Texas and Georgia are participating members of the Nurse Licensure Compact. During week 6 of his grueling contract, Robert finds himself in a severe, unavoidable clinical disagreement with a deeply resentful permanent charge nurse regarding the rapid triage priority of a critical incoming patient. Robert is actively advocating for the immediate safety of his assigned patient, utilizing entirely correct, evidence-based clinical guidelines. However, the permanent charge nurse, feeling administratively challenged by a temporary contractor who earns triple her annual salary, decides to quietly retaliate. She bypasses the standard hospital conflict resolution protocols and files a formal, highly subjective, and completely unproven administrative complaint directly with the Georgia Board of Nursing, vaguely citing unprofessional conduct and a failure to follow verbal facility directives. Under the stringent, unforgiving rules of the Nurse Licensure Compact, this single localized complaint does not remain isolated within the borders of Georgia. The absolute second the Georgia Board of Nursing opens a preliminary investigation, they are legally mandated to immediately flag Robert's profile in Nurses, the massive interconnected national database utilized by every single nursing regulatory body in the country. Because Robert is operating under his multi-state privilege, the Georgia Board instantaneously notifies his primary licensing board in Texas. Without a single formal legal hearing, without a shred of concrete clinical evidence, and without affording Robert any immediate opportunity to aggressively defend his professional actions, his entire multi-state practicing privilege is immediately frozen pending a massive, slow-moving bureaucratic investigation. The financial and logistical fallout is absolutely catastrophic. The hospital in Atlanta immediately terminates his contract, citing the active board investigation as a severe violation of their corporate compliance policies. The third-party staffing agency, fiercely protecting their own master vendor contracts, instantly abandons him, blacklisting his profile and canceling his massive weekly paychecks. Robert is now completely stranded in an expensive short-term apartment in Georgia, legally barred from accepting any new travel contracts in over 40 different states, while still actively owing thousands of dollars in rent. Furthermore, because he is a temporary contractor, he does not have access to the powerful union representation or the dedicated hospital legal defense teams that permanent staff nurses actively utilize to quickly quash these exact types of malicious, retaliatory complaints. Robert is forced to completely drain his hard-earned savings to hire a specialized administrative defense attorney out of his own pocket, a legal process that historical case studies show can drag on for 6 to 18 excruciating months before his name is finally cleared and his license is fully restored. This constant, unrelenting state of extreme legal and clinical high alert actively destroys the physical and psychological well-being of the professional travel nurse. We must now violently shatter the ubiquitous, highly curated social media illusion of the travel nursing lifestyle. The massive agency marketing machines constantly push viral images of young, attractive nurses hiking majestic national parks on Tuesday afternoons or drinking tropical cocktails on pristine beaches between their highly lucrative shifts. The unvarnished biological reality of working 3 consecutive 12-hour shifts in a hostile, unfamiliar intensive care unit is drastically different. Let us examine the profound physiological toll of the travel nursing schedule. When a nurse like Robert finally finishes his 3rd consecutive shift at 7 in the morning on a Sunday, his body is actively experiencing severe, acute endocrine disruption. His cortisol levels are massively elevated from 96 hours of sustained, life-or-death clinical stress. His circadian rhythm is completely shattered from navigating constantly rotating day and night shifts, a common scheduling manipulation utilized by hospital management to fill the most undesirable gaps in their permanent staff roster. The highly anticipated first day off is almost entirely consumed by a comatose, medically necessary state of deep biological recovery. The nurse is completely isolated in an unfamiliar, often sterile corporate apartment, lacking the critical, deeply ingrained social support network of family and long-term friends that permanent residents heavily rely upon for basic emotional regulation. When the physical fog finally begins to lift on the second day off, the reality of transient domestic life violently sets in. There is no time for luxurious, carefree exploration. The travel nurse must frantically navigate an entirely new city, simply to secure basic survival necessities. They must figure out the complex logistics of an unfamiliar local grocery store, locate a reliable laundromat if their exorbitant short-term rental does not include necessary appliances, and spend hours meticulously updating their incredibly demanding agency compliance files, scheduling mandatory mid-contract tuberculosis tests or fingerprinting sessions just to maintain their eligibility for their next potential assignment. If the travel nurse actually falls physically ill due to the massive viral loads they are constantly exposed to in the hospital environment, they do not have an established primary care physician in this new city. They are forced to utilize highly expensive, out-of-network urgent care clinics, navigating the massive deductibles of the subpar, high-premium corporate health insurance policies provided by the staffing agencies. By the time the third day off arrives, the severe, crushing psychological anticipation of returning to the hostile clinical environment begins to rapidly build. The travel nurse is perpetually living out of a suitcase, constantly aware that their current existence is fundamentally temporary. They routinely miss critical life milestones occurring back in their permanent home state, the weddings, the funerals, the family holidays, completely sacrificing their personal relationships on the altar of accelerated financial gain. Yet, despite the immense legal dangers, the toxic hospital environments, and the profound physical isolation, the human ability to adapt is truly extraordinary. Around week 10 of the grueling 13-week contract, a dangerous psychological shift occurs. The travel nurse finally figures out the complex computer system. They finally learn the exact locations of the emergency supply rooms. They finally manage to earn a microscopic shred of begrudging respect from the permanent charge nurse. The severe anxiety begins to temporarily subside, replaced by a precarious, fragile sense of clinical routine. And it is in this exact, highly vulnerable moment of physical exhaustion and sudden comfort that the massive corporate staffing agencies spring the most mathematically devastating financial trap in the entire industry. As the contract end date rapidly approaches, the recruiter enthusiastically calls with a seemingly perfect solution: the contract extension. But what exactly is the dreaded mid-contract rate drop? And how do these multi-billion-dollar corporate algorithms specifically calculate the exact psychological moment a travel nurse is simply too tired to pack their car and move to a new city, legally slashing their weekly take-home pay by 40% the exact second they sign the renewal paperwork? Let us examine the exact mathematical architecture of the mid-contract rate drop, a widespread corporate maneuver that historical trends show is utilized in over 60% of all travel nurse contract extensions. Imagine if you are Amanda, an intensive care unit nurse operating in Seattle, Washington, during the fall of 2026. Amanda originally signed a highly lucrative 13-week contract grossing $3,800 a week. By week 10, the excruciating clinical orientation phase is a distant memory. Amanda has finally mastered the heavily customized charting software. She has memorized the exact physical layout of the critical care supply rooms, and she has even established a functional, albeit strictly professional, rapport with the permanent charge nurses. She has also signed a flexible month-to-month lease on a furnished apartment, effectively neutralizing the massive initial logistical nightmare of relocating. The corporate staffing agency possesses massive amounts of predictive data regarding human behavioral psychology. They know precisely how much physical and emotional energy it requires to pack a car, drive 2,000 miles, secure new short-term housing, and endure another grueling hospital orientation. They actively weaponize this biological exhaustion against the nurse. During week 11, Amanda receives a highly scripted phone call from her corporate recruiter. The recruiter enthusiastically offers a 13-week contract extension, framing it as a massive professional compliment from the hospital administration. However, buried deep within the attached digital paperwork is a devastating mathematical reality. The new weekly gross pay has been aggressively slashed from $3,800 down to $2,200. The recruiter will utilize heavily rehearsed industry talking points, claiming that the regional hospital market has fundamentally stabilized, or that the facility administration has unilaterally slashed the master bill rate across the board. While hospital bill rates do fluctuate based on patient census and seasonal respiratory trends, case studies frequently reveal a much darker corporate reality. Often, the hospital has not reduced their specific financial payout to the agency at all. Instead, the third-party staffing agency is actively choosing to widen their internal corporate profit margin by directly cannibalizing the travel nurse's weekly take-home pay. They are essentially placing a massive financial wager on Amanda's sheer physical exhaustion. They mathematically calculate that Amanda will simply swallow the massive pay cut rather than face the terrifying prospect of sudden unemployment and the grueling logistical nightmare of another cross-country relocation. The agency understands that the friction of moving is a massive deterrent, and they leverage that precise friction to maximize their own corporate revenue. If Amanda refuses to sign the fundamentally insulting extension offer, she is immediately plunged back into the chaotic, hyper-competitive travel nurse job market, with less than 14 days to secure a completely new assignment. But let us explore the potential outcomes if Amanda actually surrenders and signs the heavily reduced extension contract. She is now working the exact same highly critical medical shifts, managing the exact same complex ventilator patients, and enduring the exact same toxic hospital politics, but for drastically less financial compensation. This sudden massive reduction in weekly revenue completely shatters her carefully constructed financial ecosystem. The expensive short-term furnished apartment lease she signed in Seattle was strictly budgeted based on her original highly lucrative pay package. With her income suddenly slashed, her fixed living expenses now consume a dangerous majority of her net pay. The entire mathematical advantage of enduring the severe isolation and high legal liability of travel nursing evaporates instantly. She is effectively trapped in a high-cost metropolitan city, working an incredibly dangerous job, and barely breaking even. Furthermore, she must still actively maintain her duplicated tax home expenses back in her permanent state of residence, creating a crushing double financial burden that rapidly drains her accumulated savings. Now, imagine the alternative scenario where Amanda absolutely refuses the rate drop and decides to walk away. The moment she officially declines the extension, the corporate recruiter's friendly demeanor vanishes completely. Amanda is suddenly designated as an uncooperative contractor. Her professional profile is instantly pushed to the absolute bottom of the agency priority list. She must now spend her highly limited, medically necessary days off frantically submitting new clinical applications, begging other competing agencies for any available high-paying contracts in entirely different states. This means completely restarting the agonizing credentialing process from absolute scratch. She must immediately schedule new 10-panel urine drug screens, submit to entirely new federal background checks, track down fresh clinical references from the very charge nurses she is about to leave behind, and spend hours completing redundant, unpaid online learning modules for a completely different hospital system. She must execute a severe, immediate termination of her Seattle apartment lease, often forfeiting a massive security deposit in the process. She must pack her entire physical existence back into her vehicle and prepare for another brutal multi-day drive across the United States. This constant forced transience is not a luxurious lifestyle choice. It is a desperate, highly stressful financial survival mechanism dictated entirely by the ruthless algorithms of corporate staffing agencies. This extreme financial volatility forces medical professionals to become hypervigilant logistical experts, constantly scanning the economic horizon for the next inevitable market disruption. Historical trends consistently demonstrate that the absolute highest-paying travel contracts are frequently located in regions experiencing severe, acute systemic failure. A travel nurse must actively chase natural disasters, massive seasonal viral outbreaks, and crippling regional staffing strikes just to maintain their high-income trajectory. This means actively driving directly into the epicenter of operational chaos. Imagine a scenario where a massive winter storm system paralyzes the northeastern United States in early 2026. Local permanent hospital staff cannot physically navigate the frozen roads to reach the facility, creating an immediate, catastrophic threat to patient life. The hospital administration triggers emergency crisis staffing protocols, legally authorizing astronomical hourly bill rates for any travel nurse willing to brave the hazardous conditions. A travel nurse must actively choose to leave the safety of their current environment, drive through treacherous, icy highways, and sleep on a temporary cot in a freezing hospital basement, simply to capitalize on the highly lucrative, extremely dangerous crisis rates. An even more perilous avenue for maximizing potential outcomes involves accepting labor dispute contracts, commonly known as strike nursing. When a permanent hospital nursing union formally votes to strike over unsafe patient ratios or stagnant wages, the hospital corporation will immediately hire a specialized temporary workforce to cross the physical picket line and keep the facility operational. The financial compensation for a strike assignment is historically unparalleled, often exceeding $10,000 for a single week of high-intensity labor. However, the physical risks and the severe professional animosity involved are staggering. The travel nurse must physically cross a highly volatile, emotionally charged picket line comprised of the exact same local community nurses they are temporarily replacing. The hospital environment inside during a massive labor strike is profoundly dangerous, stripped of all standard operational support staff, and heavily militarized by private corporate security firms. The travel nurse must operate in a state of absolute clinical isolation, managing maximum capacity patient loads with zero institutional familiarity, all while facing intense, enduring hostility from the permanent workforce that will inevitably return once the labor dispute is finally settled. This constant pursuit of crisis contracts, the endless relocation, and the relentless negotiation with hostile corporate agencies eventually pushes many highly skilled travel nurses to their absolute breaking point. When a nurse is chronically exhausted, deeply financially stressed, and constantly fighting for their professional survival, conflicts with hospital administration become a statistical inevitability. The sheer volume of stress makes it impossible to maintain a perfect, compliant corporate facade at all times. And this brings us to the most terrifying, secretive, and highly punitive mechanism utilized by the modern American healthcare system to control and permanently silence temporary medical workers. What exactly happens when a travel nurse politely refuses an unsafe, legally dangerous clinical assignment, and how does the hospital administration utilize a shadowy, unregulated digital blacklist known as the Do Not Return list to completely destroy a nurse's professional reputation across hundreds of interconnected medical facilities nationwide with a single unverified keystroke? To comprehend the terrifying scope of the Do Not Return designation, we must first understand the invisible multi-billion-dollar digital infrastructure that silently governs the entire temporary healthcare staffing industry. In the current year of 2026, the American medical system is highly monopolized. Independent community hospitals have been aggressively swallowed by massive, interconnected corporate healthcare conglomerates. These megacorporations utilize highly sophisticated, algorithmic vendor management systems to handle their temporary labor force. When a hospital manager decides to terminate a travel nurse, they do not simply send an email to the agency. They log into this centralized digital portal, click a heavily standardized drop-down menu, and permanently flag the nurse professional profile with the Do Not Return status. This single, highly subjective administrative action requires absolutely no burden of proof, zero objective clinical evidence, and offers the accused medical professional absolutely no formal avenue for due process or professional defense. Imagine, if you will, Marcus, a highly specialized cardiovascular operating room nurse with 8 years of impeccable clinical experience, working a demanding spring contract in a massive hospital network in Dallas, Texas. During week 7 of his assignment, Marcus is abruptly instructed by the surgical charge nurse to independently circulate a highly complex open-heart procedure involving an unfamiliar, highly experimental cardiopulmonary bypass machine that he has never been formally trained to operate. Operating this specific life support machinery without mandatory, rigorous certification is a direct, severe violation of the Texas Board of Nursing regulations and immediately places the patient in catastrophic, life-threatening danger. Marcus, strictly adhering to his ethical obligations and fiercely protecting his professional license, politely but firmly refuses the specific assignment, formally requesting a different surgical room or an experienced preceptor to assist him. The charge nurse, entirely focused on maintaining strict operating room turnaround times and preventing surgical delays that cost the facility thousands of dollars per minute, does not engage in a clinical debate. She simply dismisses Marcus for the day and immediately contacts the hospital's staffing office. By the time Marcus navigates the massive hospital parking garage and starts his vehicle, his digital fate has already been sealed. The hospital administration logs into their vendor management system and aggressively applies a Do Not Return status to his profile, vaguely citing insubordination and refusal to provide patient care. The following morning, Marcus receives a devastatingly brief phone call from his corporate agency recruiter. He is officially terminated without cause. But the sheer terror of this situation extends far beyond the immediate, massive loss of his current weekly income. Because this specific hospital in Dallas is owned by a massive corporate conglomerate that simultaneously operates over 40 different medical facilities, emergency centers, and outpatient surgical clinics across the entire state of Texas, that single do not return flag instantaneously propagates across the entire regional network. Historical trends explicitly demonstrate that vendor management systems are highly interconnected. If Marcus subsequently applies for a completely different travel nursing contract at a completely different hospital located 300 miles away in Houston, his application will be instantaneously and automatically rejected by the centralized software algorithm before a human recruiter ever even sees his meticulously crafted resume. He has been effectively shadow banned from a massive sector of the regional healthcare economy based on a single unverified and highly retaliatory complaint. The massive third-party staffing agency, which heavily markets itself as a fiercely loyal advocate for its nursing contractors, will completely abandon Marcus in this exact scenario. The agency strictly views the multi-billion-dollar hospital conglomerate as their true client, not the individual nurse. To actively dispute a do not return designation would require the agency to directly challenge the hospital management, heavily risking their highly lucrative, exclusive master vendor contracts. Therefore, the agency simply completely ignores Marcus, quietly disabling his internal corporate profile and swiftly moving on to the next available, deeply unsuspecting recruit. The psychological ramifications of this unregulated corporate blacklist are profoundly devastating and actively shape the daily clinical behavior of every single travel nurse operating in the United States. Because travel nurses are acutely aware of the ever-present, looming threat of the do not return algorithm, they are heavily coerced into accepting highly dangerous, clinically inappropriate, and legally perilous patient assignments. They are fundamentally forced to constantly walk on a terrifying professional tightrope, actively compromising their own strict ethical standards and jeopardizing their hard-earned medical licenses, simply to avoid angering a vindictive hospital administrator who holds the unilateral digital power to instantly destroy their entire temporary career trajectory. A travel nurse will silently endure intense verbal abuse from permanent staff. They will skip federally mandated meal breaks. They will manage wildly unsafe patient ratios, and they will operate highly unfamiliar, incredibly dangerous medical equipment, all because the sheer financial terror of the algorithmic blacklist completely overrides their fundamental instinct for self-preservation. If a travel nurse actually attempts the agonizing, incredibly tedious process of formally clearing a do not return designation, they will quickly discover a deliberate, highly sophisticated bureaucratic labyrinth, explicitly designed to exhaust their limited resources. Case studies reveal that a nurse must attempt to independently contact the exact hospital human resources department that initiated the ban, a department that legally considers the nurse a complete stranger because they were technically a third-party independent contractor, not an official facility employee. The hospital will completely refuse to release any internal documentation regarding the termination, heavily citing proprietary corporate policies and potential legal liabilities. The nurse has absolutely zero access to union representation, zero access to the facility grievance process, and zero ability to subpoena the highly subjective electronic communications that led to their algorithmic execution. Historical data suggests that less than a fraction of 1% of all do not return designations are ever successfully overturned by the individual medical professional. The professional is simply forced to completely abandon that entire geographic region, hastily packing their vehicle and desperately fleeing to a completely different state with a completely different hospital network, hoping the digital footprint of the retaliatory blacklist does not eventually follow them across state lines. This constant, unrelenting state of severe psychological warfare, combined with the brutal, grueling physical demands of working continuous 12-hour critical care shifts in fiercely hostile environments, eventually culminates in a catastrophic physiological breakdown. The travel nurse is existing entirely on highly elevated adrenaline, chronic sleep deprivation, and extreme financial anxiety. They are aggressively pushing the absolute limits of human endurance, heavily relying on massive amounts of caffeine and over-the-counter anti-inflammatory medications simply to survive the next shift. But the human body is fundamentally not designed to sustain this extreme level of continuous, highly pressurized occupational trauma. The physical corner cutting becomes a severe, statistical inevitability when a nurse is chronically exhausted, highly isolated, and desperately rushing to manage a rapidly deteriorating patient while simultaneously terrified of administrative retaliation. the physical mechanics of their highly demanding labor begin to violently deteriorate. This brings us directly to the most catastrophic, life-altering vulnerability in the entire temporary medical staffing ecosystem. What exactly happens when a completely exhausted travel nurse, operating under immense corporate pressure, physically snaps a lumbar vertebra while desperately attempting to catch a falling 200-pound paralyzed patient entirely alone? And how does the highly complex, inherently predatory system of temporary contractor workers' compensation actively maneuver to leave them permanently disabled, entirely stripped of their massive income, and completely abandoned by the massive corporate machinery that deliberately placed them in that devastating situation? The following content is provided strictly for educational and entertainment purposes only and does not constitute professional career, financial, legal, tax, or medical advice. The discussions regarding travel nursing compensation, contract terms, housing stipends, workers' compensation, and regulatory trends are based on historical trends, publicly available data, and individual case studies. The healthcare industry is highly dynamic, and individual results or potential outcomes will vary significantly based on geographic location, clinical specialty, agency negotiation, and market demand. Viewers must conduct their own comprehensive due diligence, consult with certified legal professionals regarding workers' compensation laws, and review all contracts with independent financial advisors before making any career transitions or financial decisions. We do not promise any specific financial results or lifestyle improvements. The experiences detailed in this masterclass reflect potential outcomes based on historical trends and should not be taken as a definitive guide to guaranteed success in the healthcare field. The legal architecture surrounding workers' compensation for temporary healthcare contractors is a masterclass in corporate liability deflection. To truly grasp the severity of this trap, we must examine the specific mechanics of dual employment and how it legally isolates the injured worker. Imagine a scenario involving Christopher, a highly seasoned orthopedic travel nurse operating in a severely underfunded rural hospital in upstate New York during the intense winter of 2026. Christopher is actively managing a highly unstable patient who suddenly begins to fall from a hospital bed. Relying on pure, unfiltered clinical instinct, Christopher physically intervenes, absorbing the massive dead weight of the patient to prevent a catastrophic head injury. In that exact fraction of a second, Christopher suffers a severe, acute herniation of 2 lumbar vertebrae. The physical pain is blinding, instantaneous, and entirely incapacitating. He is immediately wheeled into the emergency department of the very hospital he was hired to staff. But the absolute second his status shifts from an active healthcare provider to a registered patient, the massive corporate entities that profit from his labor immediately initiate a highly choreographed legal retreat. Historical trends in occupational injury law demonstrate that hospital administrations universally shield themselves behind the strict legal definition of the temporary contractor. When Christopher files the initial workplace injury report, the hospital risk management department immediately dismisses any direct financial liability. They legally argue that Christopher is not a recognized employee of their specific facility. He is technically a contracted employee of the third-party staffing agency located halfway across the country in Omaha, Nebraska. The hospital essentially washes their hands of the entire devastating event. Christopher must then turn to his agency recruiter to initiate the workers' compensation claim. This introduces the most mathematically devastating financial loophole in the entire travel nursing industry. As we previously established in granular detail, a massive percentage of a travel nurse pay package is legally structured as non-taxable stipends for duplicated housing and meals. A typical contract might offer a base hourly wage of strictly $22, mathematically supplemented by $2,000 a week in tax-free stipends. When the corporate workers' compensation insurance adjuster calculates Christopher's legally mandated lost wage replacement, they utilize a strictly literal interpretation of federal tax law. They completely and entirely exclude the massive weekly stipends from their mathematical formula, because stipends are legally classified as expense reimbursements, not actual earned income. Therefore, Christopher's total disability compensation is calculated solely on that artificially suppressed base rate of $22 an hour. Under standard workers' compensation regulations, he will receive roughly 66% of that base rate. A highly skilled medical professional who was grossing nearly $3,000 a week just 48 hours prior is suddenly legally reduced to surviving on a fraction of minimum wage, receiving a devastatingly small check of perhaps $500 a week. This catastrophic reduction in cash flow occurs at the exact moment his financial obligations exponentially multiply. Christopher is still legally bound to his expensive, short-term furnished apartment lease in New York, and he is still actively paying the massive mortgage on his permanent tax home in Ohio. He is immediately plunged into a state of severe, inescapable financial ruin. But the systemic betrayal does not end with the mathematical manipulation of his lost wages. We must now examine the terrifying fragility of corporate health insurance tied to temporary staffing contracts. Agency-provided health insurance is notorious for its strict, unforgiving activation and termination clauses. Coverage is completely contingent upon the nurse actively logging clinical hours. When Christopher suffers his severe spinal injury and physically cannot report to his scheduled shifts, he fails to meet the strict minimum hourly requirements mandated by the corporate insurance policy. The staffing agency, fiercely protecting their own internal corporate overhead, will aggressively move to cancel his specific 13-week contract due to his physical inability to fulfill the clinical obligations. The exact second that contract is officially terminated, Christopher's comprehensive health insurance is instantaneously severed. He is now stranded in an expensive out-of-state geographic location, actively requiring highly specialized neurosurgical intervention and months of intense physical rehabilitation, completely stripped of his primary health insurance. The workers' compensation carrier will aggressively dispute and delay authorization for every single necessary medical procedure, utilizing highly paid corporate medical examiners to deliberately stall his recovery timeline. Christopher is left entirely abandoned, forced to rapidly liquidate his entire retirement portfolio simply to avoid permanent, crippling medical debt. This devastating reality is not an isolated incident. It represents a massive systemic vulnerability that actively threatens every single temporary medical worker in the United States. And as we navigate through the highly turbulent economic landscape of 2026, the pressures on the travel nurse are rapidly multiplying from entirely new, highly sophisticated technological vectors. The golden era of unrestrained, astronomically high crisis contracts is facing a massive coordinated legislative and algorithmic crackdown. Hospital conglomerates, deeply exhausted by the massive financial bleeding caused by reliance on expensive third-party agencies, have aggressively lobbied state and federal legislatures to intervene. We are currently witnessing historical trends where numerous states are actively attempting to pass highly controversial bill rate cap legislation. These proposed laws strictly dictate the absolute maximum hourly rate a staffing agency can legally charge a medical facility. While these legislative maneuvers are publicly framed as necessary interventions to prevent corporate price gouging, the immediate, real-world consequence is a massive, sudden suppression of the travel nurse pay package. The agencies, utterly refusing to compress their own massive profit margins, immediately pass the financial deficit directly down to the contractor, aggressively slashing weekly take-home pay across the board. Simultaneously, the widespread integration of predictive artificial intelligence into hospital census management has fundamentally altered the exact nature of the travel contract. Just a few years ago, hospitals utilized highly reactive, manual scheduling systems, hiring travel nurses based on immediate, visible gaps in their workforce. Today, highly advanced algorithmic software analyzes massive datasets, including historical seasonal admission rates, local epidemiological viral tracking, and highly specific community demographic trends, to predict precise hospital census drops weeks in advance. If the predictive algorithm calculates a 20% reduction in emergency department volume for the upcoming month of November, the hospital vendor management system will automatically execute massive, coordinated cancellations of dozens of travel nurse contracts before those nurses even finish packing their vehicles. The highly sought-after 13-week guaranteed contract has effectively become a nostalgic myth, entirely replaced by a highly volatile, ruthlessly efficient digital gig economy, where a specialized intensive care nurse can be algorithmically deactivated with the exact same casual speed as a rideshare driver. The travel nurse operating in this modern environment is actively fighting a massive, multi-front war for basic professional survival. They are physically battling the grueling, deteriorating conditions at the actual hospital bedside, legally battling the predatory tax structures of the Internal Revenue Service, and economically battling massive corporate algorithms designed specifically to minimize their financial compensation. The sheer, overwhelming weight of this constant, multifaceted pressure forces a critical, inevitable point of professional reckoning. Why do thousands of highly intelligent, incredibly capable medical professionals continue to actively participate in a system fundamentally designed to exploit their labor, destroy their physical health, and constantly threaten their hard-earned professional licenses. What is the profound psychological anchor keeping them tethered to this chaotic existence, and more importantly, how do the absolute top-tier veteran travel nurses utilize a highly secretive, incredibly complex operational framework to completely bypass these massive corporate traps and actively build multi-million-dollar generational wealth completely outside the traditional medical system? The fundamental difference between the temporary contractor who inevitably burns out after 2 grueling years and the elite veteran who achieves absolute financial sovereignty lies in a profound, deeply calculated psychological shift. The top 1% of temporary medical professionals operating in the year 2026 do not view their massive weekly paychecks as a permanent, sustainable career trajectory. They view that high-velocity income as a strictly temporary, highly volatile tool for rapid capital accumulation. They possess a deep structural understanding that the hospital system is fundamentally designed to extract their physical labor until their bodies physically break down under the relentless pressure of 12-hour shifts. Therefore, they deliberately engineer a strict financial escape velocity. Imagine if you are Victoria, a highly specialized neonatal intensive care nurse. During her first year of travel, Victoria witnessed the devastating financial traps, the abrupt contract cancellations, and the terrifying algorithmic blacklists we previously detailed. Instead of upgrading her personal vehicle or inflating her lifestyle with expensive designer goods to cope with the severe clinical stress, she adopted a strategy of radical financial defense. She actively sought out the absolute highest-paying, most undesirable crisis contracts in severe weather regions, specifically because those assignments offered the highest mathematical margin between gross income and local living expenses. Victoria utilized a sophisticated concept known as extreme geographic arbitrage. Based on historical trends in real estate and capital markets, the massive tax-free stipends generated in high-cost coastal cities like San Francisco or Seattle can be actively funneled into acquiring cash-flowing assets in entirely different, low-cost-of-living geographic markets. While Victoria was working grueling 72-hour weeks in California, she was systematically purchasing duplexes and triplexes in the suburban Midwest. She understood that relying solely on her physical body and a vulnerable professional license to generate income was the ultimate liability. By aggressively deploying her capital into tangible real estate, she began replacing her active clinical income with passive rental revenue. Within 4 years, Victoria had successfully acquired a portfolio of several multifamily properties. The combined monthly cash flow from these assets eventually eclipsed her base nursing salary, effectively rendering her completely immune to the terrifying corporate threats of sudden contract cancellations. If a hospital administrator ever threatened her with a retaliatory disciplinary action, Victoria could simply walk away without a single ounce of financial anxiety, because her ultimate survival was no longer tied to the medical-industrial complex. But the most sophisticated wealth-building strategy, currently utilized by veteran travel nurses, involves actively cannibalizing the very industry that originally exploited them. Let us examine a highly lucrative framework based on historical case studies of specialized real estate investment. Imagine if you are Jonathan, an emergency room nurse who spent 5 years meticulously studying the exact geographical movement patterns of transient medical workers across the United States. Jonathan recognized that the single greatest pain point for any travel nurse is securing safe, affordable short-term furnished housing near major medical centers without being completely defrauded by online scammers. Instead of continuing to work exclusively at the bedside, Jonathan transitioned his accumulated capital into purchasing single-family homes located precisely within a 2-mile radius of massive, high-volume hospital networks. He completely renovated these properties, optimizing them specifically for night shift medical workers by installing absolute blackout window treatments, advanced acoustic soundproofing materials in the walls, and localized climate control systems in every single bedroom to ensure deep, uninterrupted biological recovery. Jonathan then completely bypassed traditional, highly saturated short-term rental platforms and marketed his properties directly within private, highly vetted travel nursing networks and secure communication channels. He understood the exact federal guidelines and the General Services Administration calculations for maximum allowable housing stipends in his specific county. By mathematically pricing his individual room rentals just slightly below that maximum federal threshold, he created an irresistible value proposition for incoming travel nurses while simultaneously capturing a massive, guaranteed stream of corporate agency money. Because his tenants were highly paid, extensively background-checked medical professionals who spent 14 hours a day outside the house working at the hospital, the physical wear and tear on his properties was virtually non-existent. Jonathan effectively built a massive microeconomy entirely sustained by the heavy financial engine of the temporary healthcare staffing industry, while radically minimizing his own exposure to the toxic clinical environment. This transition from exploited laborer to independent business owner requires a rigorous, professional-grade restructuring of personal tax liabilities. The most successful travel nurses in 2026 do not operate as standard, highly taxed employees for massive corporate agencies. They actively establish formal legal entities, such as limited liability companies or S-corporations, to fundamentally alter their relationship with the federal tax code. By operating as an independent corporate entity, these professionals can legally draft their own highly specific master service agreements directly with smaller, regional hospital networks or private surgical centers, completely cutting out the multi-billion-dollar third-party staffing agencies that traditionally siphon away 40% of the billable hourly rate. This advanced operational framework allows the independent nurse contractor to drastically increase their gross revenue while simultaneously unlocking massive, legally protected corporate tax deductions that are entirely unavailable to the standard individual employee. They can legally write off specialized medical equipment, highly expensive continuing education certifications, travel logistics, and comprehensive professional liability insurance premiums as standard business expenses, aggressively shielding their wealth from excessive taxation while operating entirely within established legal parameters. Furthermore, the ultimate exit strategy for these veteran professionals often involves leveraging their deep, specialized clinical knowledge to establish highly lucrative, niche medical businesses completely outside the traditional hospital infrastructure. Historical trends show a massive surge in nurse-owned enterprises over the past several years. Consider the rapid expansion of specialized intravenous hydration clinics, boutique medical aesthetic practices, independent care management agencies, and highly specialized legal nurse consulting firms. A travel nurse who has spent a decade deciphering highly complex, often deliberately obfuscated electronic medical records possesses an incredibly valuable, highly monetizable analytical skill set. Lawyers prosecuting massive, multi-million-dollar medical malpractice lawsuits actively require the precise, forensic expertise of a veteran clinical nurse to systematically deconstruct hospital charting timelines, interpret complex physiological data, and conclusively identify fatal deviations from standard care protocols. By transitioning into independent legal consulting, a former travel nurse can easily command hourly billing rates that completely dwarf even the most lucrative pandemic-era crisis contracts, while operating entirely from the safety, autonomy, and absolute comfort of their own private home office. The journey of the modern American travel nurse is a profound, incredibly high-stakes study in raw economic survival. It is a grueling multi-front war fought within the sterile, brilliantly lit hallways of a rapidly recalibrating medical infrastructure. The professionals who step into this temporary arena are subjected to intense psychological manipulation, severe physical degradation, and constant, looming legal peril. The massive corporate machinery of the healthcare staffing industry is fundamentally designed to extract maximum value from their labor, while aggressively transferring every single ounce of operational liability directly onto their shoulders. Yet, as we have meticulously explored through these comprehensive case studies and historical data points, the individuals who survive the initial brutal shock of this highly toxic environment often emerge with an unparalleled level of clinical resilience and a terrifyingly sharp understanding of modern economic strategy. They transform from vulnerable idealistic caregivers into highly sophisticated, heavily armored independent operators who actively force the broken system to fund their ultimate financial liberation. But achieving this absolute sovereignty requires navigating one final, incredibly dangerous obstacle. As massive hospital conglomerates realize that their most experienced, highly skilled labor force is rapidly escaping their control to build independent wealth, they are heavily deploying powerful lobbying firms to pass restrictive new state legislation specifically designed to crush independent nursing businesses and force these professionals back to the bedside. How exactly are these massive corporate entities weaponizing local state medical boards to legally prosecute independent nurse entrepreneurs? And what is the exact step-by-step legal defense blueprint the top 1% are currently using to aggressively fight back and completely bulletproof their privately owned medical empires against this unprecedented corporate assault?